Some of you may become somewhat uncomfortable as parts of this film unfold, but I think if you listen carefully...
Nature has intended
Today,
that you
everybody
have to be a
A healthy, happy sex life is the most wonderful and terribly. We've all experienced curiosity about ourselves and the opposite sex. Who hasn't?
Welcome to Remedial Sex Ed. This week's episode is the first of many that we would like to do on religion and sex. If you Google how many religions there are in the world, the result that comes to you is 4,200. Maybe. We could have a podcast that solely focuses on organized religion's effect on human sexuality and literally talk about nothing else. When I first conceived this particular episode, I really wanted to interview an authoritative representative from the big five that first come to my mind, which are Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism. But like most things in my life, my ambitions were greater than our reality. This is episode 8 of our Little Baby podcast, and the guests that we've had up until this point have come from either people that we know really well or close friends of close friends. So today we have to offer you one Christian perspective and one Buddhist perspective. We released this episode the Monday after Easter, and that was very much on purpose. It's also Passover this week. We tried our hardest to get a rabbi on the show. That didn't work. Did you know that people don't like talking about sex? Crazy, right? Seriously, we have like a success rate of maybe 50% of getting the people we ask to agree to come on the show. If you're an individual with religious authority and you would like to come and talk with us and let us record you and broadcast it out upon the internet, we would absolutely love to have you. You can even choose who you want to interview. If it's myself or Colin or Marcella, we are all very nice people. And for me personally, I'm someone who considers herself spiritual, but I was raised outside of any religious belief. But I love talking religion. I love knowing what other people have to say on the subject. It's cool. Our first interview is with a gentleman I have known for a very long time. His name is Matt Cain. He is a youth minister at Mount Olympus Presbyterian in Salt Lake City, Utah. He is the older brother of one of my closest friends in the world. We were both each other's maids of honor. I am very fortunate he agreed to let me record him, and he was the first thing I recorded for this podcast. Consent was episode 1, and Hannah was the interview for that episode, but I knew we were going to cover religion over Easter, and I happened to be in Utah at the time, so I took the opportunity that was available to me, and as this is the first thing I ever recorded, I made a million mistakes. First off, I left the mic cord in Long Beach, so Matt and I had to drive from his office to his house to pick up a spare. I don't know if he caught this or not, but like while we were in the church office that he has, and I was searching desperately for the cord in my backpack, my spare black brassiere for the weekend spilled out onto the table in front of the youth minister, my brother from my non-blood family. And I'm really sorry, Matt. Much love. Would love to interview you again. Matt wanted me to make it very clear that his opinions and statements he has to say on this episode are his own and do not necessarily reflect the stance of Mount Olympus Presbyterian. However, I did learn that Mount Olympus does teach sex ed, and I had to cut the details of this program for the sake of time, but it is a comprehensive sex education course that takes 6 weeks. With doctors and therapists, and they teach about all options for contraception and condoms. And I have been upset for years that I was not taught sex ed in my youth, and all I had to do was go to church. Obviously, this is not always the case, but if you are a youth in Salt Lake County or a parent of a youth, I highly recommend you check it out. Matt says they only do this program like once every 3 years or so because they do it for the entire youth congregation. So they have to wait for a new generation of junior high school kids to come in, and then the high schoolers get it again. But from the sound of it, the high school teenagers pay a lot more attention on the second go around. Let's jump right in. Okay, so today I am talking with Matt. Hi, Matt.
How's it going?
It's going well. How about yourself?
Doing excellent.
So, Matt, who are you?
My name's Matt Cain, and I work for Mount Olympus Presbyterian Church, and I've been leading and helping run, and now I'm in charge of an evening service that's really geared towards people who don't like church, but I work for a church.
Excellent. Now, I've known you for many, many moons.
Mm-hmm.
And I also know that on top of definitely being very in touch with your spiritual and religious side, you are also a very easy person to talk to, and you're actually pretty understanding of all walks of life around you.
Thanks, sir, for saying that.
No worries. So I kind of wanted to talk to you on a couple of subjects,
mm-hmm.
and I guess I wanted to start first and foremost with kind of what is the Presbyterian view on sex?
What's the Presbyterian view?
Yeah.
I think when we talk about sex and religion, and particularly the evangelical church, we have a long history talking about sex, and so does Judaism as well. And so we're talking about something that's built into humanity. Right? And so anytime we're talking with students or we're talking about sex here, we need to understand that God made sex. Mm-hmm. That it's really one of the first commandments that's given to mankind is to steward, right, what's been given in creation, in this creation poem that was so richly given to us in Genesis. Mm-hmm. But a second part of that is to multiply. Right? And we also take this bent that, what's so cool about our biology is that, we have whole pieces of humanity that are built for pleasure. Mm-hmm. And so when we talk about sex, it's such a loaded question to ask, what's the Presbyterian view? I think some things we really try and focus. Here's one other piece of history, okay? Around the first to third century, there was a group called the Gnostics. And the Gnostics really believed that all physical sense of life was evil. And it was through learning and the special understanding that you attained was really goodness or spirituality, and was really the thing that saved you, right? And that's been something that's plagued the Christian church for almost 2,000 years now.
Okay.
And so, however, we have whole books, right? The Song of Solomon, that are about sex, and really, our piece of, I think, the religious aspect of this is that sex is meant to mirror God's love for mankind, right? And more particularly that sex is meant to represent the unity in marriage of God's love and Jesus' love for the church, but God's love of mankind. So, kind of your take on it is that the view has kind of been skewed throughout the past years? It's so complex. Yeah. And if you couldn't tell, we're not great about talking about it today, right? Sure. And even in the last 100 years, there's lots of I think there's actually a big shame culture around not talking about it, right?
Yeah.
And so it's either it's either put into these two camps of either, sexuality, you're just this animal, right? Mm-hmm. And have sex with whoever you want, and it doesn't matter about ethic, and it's just like eating food, right?
Yeah.
And what's so great about the Bible is we think this is a modern idea. It's not. Corinthians, right? And Roman culture, in the Greeks, they've been talking about sex and did way wilder things openly as part of public society than we ever could.
Yeah.
And so even that idea of like food for the stomach is like this Roman saying, and it appears in the Bible. Yeah, it's physical, but I think also we need to be wary about the other side of things, and especially talking spirituality and education or understanding is this idea of being angels, right? Of it's just spirituality and it's just procreation. And when we sell sex as like this bad thing religiously, we actually create a big shame culture around it, right?
Yes.
We lose education. We lose the ability to dialogue. I think we also create inherent systems. The basis of shame is this, that not that I've done something bad, but I am bad.
Yeah.
Right? And I think we haven't done a great job distinguishing that. And so really when we drive this, that sex is this thing that you're not supposed to do or only supposed to do in this tight little box, right? When we have sexual urges, when, especially teenagers, when there's floods of hormones going on and it's instinctual, like to all, sexual creatures, right? We create this inner turmoil that says, because I have these feelings, I'm bad, or I'm wrong, or I'm disconnected from God. And that's simply not true. We're built in, like it's somewhere in this balance, right?
I'm very glad to hear you say that, because I think there are a lot of stereotypes that link religious belief and shame, like that it's a very linear. Would you agree that what's the proper way to phrase this? This kind of connection between Christianity and shame regarding our bodies, is it something that you see as an overlapping problem with? I don't know how to...
It's hard because you're talking about... I think it's hard because you're talking about culture. But it's interesting that you talk about like our bodies, because one of the things we do talk about here is we talk about gender, right? And I think sometimes we've looked at gender, particularly religiously, right? God, male and female, he created them, right? And we looked at this like these two check boxes. And really, if you talk or look at even just your close friends and family, there's no box to subscribe to, right? One of the ways that I like to talk about that is that maybe they're not boxes that you have to live into, but maybe they're a beginning place to start a description, right? That maybe this is a gender description, and certainly that's changed over time, right? Right now, I think of like my parents, right? And men probably wouldn't cry around their families. To give like a hug or a kiss to your kids would seem like it's this almost sign of weakness, right? I still think there's this strong sense of like, I'd rather die on my horse, And when we look at a large portion of cultures throughout the world, we get like, even in gendered language, right? We have things like poetry or flowers that are all masculine nouns. I don't think it's quite as tight-knit as and subscriptive as we'd like to make it.
Okay. I'm going to be honest with you.
Yeah.
I never attended Sunday school growing up.
Yeah.
I know very little about the Bible outside of a context that I needed to know for English literature or for my performing arts degree.
Yeah.
As my understanding, the Bible has a very clear definition that sex is intended to be saved from marriage and only within the confines of that marriage. Fact?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is it also intended to be enjoyed in that marriage?
So much. Yeah. Well, I think maybe let's broaden let's broaden the scope a little bit. Sexuality, again, and our identity is meant to be connected to God. Might be a good way to say that.
Okay.
Right. And so we need to come from this understanding that spirituality is other to spirituality is ingrained in humanity and is meant to be connected, right? If you look again at the Genesis poem, right, we have these descriptions of the heavens, right, and the earth, and throughout that poem, creation and the created world gets more and more complex, right? We have the stars in the sky, and then we have the sky and the sea and land, but then things change and we have like fish and birds, right? Before that we have plants, and then from plants we go to like bushes and then trees and then seeds, which seems a little bit more like not as complex, but yet we have these things that produce these complex organisms, right? From the heaven perspective, right, it comes down and it becomes, we start out with like God, and then we move to creation and heavens, right? And then in Genesis 2 it says like God breathed into the dust, into the dirt, and that's mankind. That's humanity. And so our spirituality, right, isn't this far off other thing, right? It's this ingrained piece of the spiritual connectedness to God and the created world. So think about how this impacts sex, right? Okay. If we say spirituality is other, and then we say, oh, sex, and we need this to procreate and thing is this physical world, right? And we hold those separate, of course they're going to be at odds, right? But if we look at this as an ingrained piece of connection, right, that spirituality is physical and it's spiritual, then of course we're going to come to the same conclusions about sex. Maybe another good way to think about sex is in what's healthy or whole, right? And sex is a couple things. It is pleasurable, right? It's relational. It's spiritual again, and it's about procreation. It's all these things, right? That informs all these things, and so I think a whole view of sex would allow it to be. I think it's funny even allowing it, right? Allow it to be, allow it to be pleasurable. But yeah, like there are whole functions of your body, right? Men and women that are simply for pleasure.
Yeah.
All our instincts and hormones are to have us have sex, right?
Yep.
None of us got here without it. Maybe lab injections, but still, regardless, like people, relationships had to sustain this. That again, this is about the connectedness, and again, think about that as a representation of God. I very much look at the full scope of the Bible, and and see it about God creating mankind and enjoying a relationship with mankind, right? And in the middle of the Bible, we have places where we totally choose our own way. We choose not connectedness, right? And the end of the Bible, in the biblical narrative, even if we're looking just at the Genesis poem, or we're talking Revelation, or we're talking the prophetic messages, the messianic texts, right, is all about being connected once again to God. So here's the thing, right? If that informs our sexuality, right, if this is meant to be representative, then of course, like, our sex is supposed to connect us. It's supposed to be relational. And I love the fact, like, life's enjoyable. It's not, like, there's suffering, like, in relationship. Of course there's suffering and sacrifice. But there's also, like, intimacy. Yeah. There's laughter. There's joy, So it's sharing all that. It's being connected.
I guess the reason I ask is it's not uncommon to come across someone who was raised within the church and they waited until marriage, and yet once they get to there, they feel such shame about it.
It's so important how we talk about it. So again, with our youth, we are very sex positive. Like, it's good. You're here. We're glad you're here, and you're here because of sex. Yeah. Again, this is something that sustains humanity. This is a grounding piece for humanity. We're sex positive. I think, honestly, the Bible's sex positive. I think, though, we can get, again, torn into some of the shame culture that we're not connected to those things. And it's how we tie back to that. And I think, it's been tied off into this, like, slippery slope of sexuality. Honestly, I think to think in terms of sex positivity, right, and sexuality is a good thing, actually puts us in a better place to have healthier, more whole sex lives with our partners.
What advice would you give to someone who's really struggling? Like, where would you turn them to if they came to you and said, I am having too much shame and I can't enjoy sex with my partner?
Oh, wow. I think as, a church leader, we're always just very careful to say, like, we're not counselors. So always, like, we're pretty therapy progressive here. Like, I think counseling is a really good thing. I think also that the Bible's really unique in that it has, in the Hebrew Bible, there's this Songs of Solomon, right? And that whole book is about a relationship of pursuit and sacrifice, but it's also about sexuality. Your neck is like a tower, your teeth are like gazelles, your breasts are like pomegranates. I think that's that would be my basis, is looking at, again, not sex as something other or wrong, but again, what does it mean for you to connect with your partner? And I think that's always going to be more beneficial. I think culturally, we need to start looking at. Just think about it this way, okay? If you were to grow up today, just guess, what do you think some of the big things to inform sexuality are?
I think if I was growing up today, a lot of it would be based off of YouTube videos. I imagine a lot of it is coming to me through various social feeds. I think Facebook's dying. It would all be about that. Sure. Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat, yeah. And I mean, so there's a significant age gap between me and my next oldest sibling. Yeah. And they had Tinder in high school, which terrifies me.
Right, yeah.
So it is a much faster pace. And I mean, I think every generation says that, because our parents said that about us with the, we grew up in the internet generation. We could literally Google anything.
Right.
So it gets faster and faster with each going year.
So think about this, okay? If it's about, like, from my perspective, if sex is about connectedness, right? If it's about things like vulnerability and intimacy, if it's about connection, if it's about trust, and we've sold sex, right, societally to gain power, right? Virtually, I think, just my own personal prediction, I think we're going to continue to see porn grow as an industry, but also we're going to see more and more children exposed to that, simply because it is so easy. And I think it's also predatory, right? If you can hook an adolescent mind to think about sex in this way, that's an industry that's going to continue to grow. I think here's the other thing, the instantaneousness, right? There's no, like, fumbling, hey, yeah, like, I really like your shoes, and, like, hi, my name's, there's no fumbling relationship to sex. Now it's like, swipe right, I'm a stud, or I'm a babe, right? I mean, think about how our culture is selling sex right now, and really we're part of, I don't know, we've been talking about it like it's a hookup culture, right? Yeah. That's not about connection. I've read whole posts and talked to friends where it's more intimate to hold hands with somebody than to have sex with them. Think about sex in these terms, that if sex is about instantaneousness, if it's about self-gratification, if it's about your niche, or, your fetish or your fix or your orgasm, right? We're going to miss, I think, this ingrained spiritual context of sex, but also really what sex is about, and sex is about relationship. I think the narrative we really need to be careful of right now is about sex for just us, right? Sex isn't a one-person act. It's relational, and I think here's the other cool part, and why I think the biblical narrative gets reinforced, is think about our hookup culture in contrast with, like, a 20-year marriage. Yeah. And I'm married, and let me tell you what, like, sex gets better. Like, we don't talk enough about this, and I wish we had more people in church that talked about this. And we try. We have marriage classes and things, and so we try and create settings where we can talk about this better. But like, the longer you're married, hopefully, the better you are at sex. Not because sex is some technique, or like that's all you need is a Cosmo magazine telling you how to be better at sex, or like. Here's the reality: is that relationship is the driving force of sex. So if your relationship continues to be more intimate and secure, if you're able to communicate and care about your partner, sex gets way better. So long the narrative has been marriage, wait till marriage, only marriage, right? But it's like we called something good and bad for the sake of a rule, right? And when we don't connect things beyond rules, right, and labels, the lesson has no value, right? Think about like maybe a good analogy that we can all relate to is like, don't cheat, right? And you go, that's dumb. Like, the whole goal of this is that I pass the test. Well, no, you idiot. Like, the whole point of the test is that you know the information, is that you learn, right? And so, of course, cheating is inherently against that notion, right? This is, maybe let's connect it a little bit. Why wait till marriage, right? This is why, is that there's a context where actually you don't need to be more sexual. The point isn't the sex. The point is that it's a whole relationship, right? So I teach a lot of college students, 20s and 30s, right? And we're trying to reconnect this piece of like, I'm going to move in with your boyfriend. And it's like, okay, you're going to do you. You're an adult, and I love that. Like, you're an adult. Let's try and reconnect to maybe why the Bible's saying what it's saying, not just for the sake of the words, but for the sake of the connection. Maybe a relationship is going to be better off in a more intimate setting, in a more holistic setting, right? In a sexual setting, in a financial setting, in a setting where you can't get away from one another. And maybe that should be backed by commitment, right? Maybe you need to learn how to trust in your faults and not be able to shy away or hide,
So while I was texting you and trying to get this all set up, you actually were doing a sex talk with your church.
Yeah.
In our public sex ed, we weren't taught any contraceptives. We weren't allowed to be taught what a condom was.
Right.
And the excuse that was given to us was, since technically we have separation of church and state, but there's a very big influence of church and state here. And it was like this idea, if you educated children on how to be safe, then they would do it.
Well, and here's the thing is, sure, absolutely, we still think that abstinence is going to be the best case. And it is. Like, you're not going to get pregnant from abstinence. You're not going to pick up an STI from abstinence, right? But abstinence only works until it doesn't.
Yeah.
And I think we also need to be more realistic about teenagers, that there are whole parts of brains that shut down under hormonal influence, right? What's great about the doctor that we brought in, the physician, is that he actually showed the graphs of different states that teach about contraception. And he showed the graphs of teen pregnancy and STIs. And surprise, places that just talk about abstinence only have higher teen pregnancy rates, and they have higher rates of infectious diseases, sexually transmitted infections.
How do you feel, for the states that don't have a comprehensive sex ed, how do you feel about how that kind of excuses like a church's influence as the reason why they don't do it?
From my perspective, I think it's actually damaging. This is so weird to say, and it's give me a sec to divulge into this. I think it actually ends up inhibiting the faith, and it becomes a megaphone issue and like a press issue. There's a lot of, I think, simple and straw man arguments against against Christianity and a faith narrative. And I guess this is why I'm saying that, is that if it's abstinence only and we know that it's not effective, right, then it puts the blame on religion and on the faith, right, instead of the practice. And so I think it can be damaging to the name of the church, right, because bad education is really what we're talking about. And I think really what we're looking for isn't a blame scenario, it's a better outcome. And again, that's why I think we've come up with the scenario that we have, that, again, our youth directors work so hard, is that what I really like about it is that it tries to do a better job of educating and having a better conversation while also elevating our understanding of sexuality and our spirituality and connectedness with God. I think there's a big fear narrative that you're going to fall into sin, right? If we talk about it or teach about it, really, I think part of the reason just the reality is churches are in decline across the whole U.S. Our generation and the one to follow is increasingly doesn't identify as religious or spiritual or connected to those things. And so I'm not going to say this is the cause, but I think I'm really interested, and I'm only talking for myself here, but like I'm really interested to know, how we present issues or dialogues, like how that does reflect back on us, and I'm always interested in knowing how we can do a better job. So again, that's kind of my big tide worm scenario, but that's my hope, is that we can, that our educators educate better, that we as a church can do a better job of actually having a dialogue and not a good or bad scenario. But for me, it's about like a deeper, richer spirituality. And whether we like it or not, or close our eyes or say that it's bad, it's happening, and more prevalently to our young people, it's a dialogue that they don't have the option to just simply look away from or ignore.
So I'm just going to say, I would have never guessed in a million years that I could have gotten a better sex education from Mount Olympus Presbyterian.
A block away from the high school.
Yeah.
Yeah, funny, huh?
Today I learned.
Week 4, we talk about sex and culture, and particularly in an oversexed culture, gender identity. We talk about consent, which is going to continue to be a big deal. But also subtle things like in a relationship, social pressure or peer pressure, even just this, oh, you're a virgin, like has an influence. And really the goal of this is to help young people develop a sexual ethic before being engulfed by it, right? The culture is subtle, and you're part of this dialogue whether you know it or not. You don't really have a choice. It's on the TV, it's on your phones, it's on Netflix, it's in your video games, it's in your books. Like, again, this is a human thing, right?
Yeah.
And it's an important piece of humanity. And so how do you recognize that and develop some critical thought? With our junior hires, that's a little abstract, when they don't really even have, girls have cooties when you're talking to an 11-year-old, not interested at all. Really different than the senior who's dating or maybe even be sexually active, and so it's this piece of saying, well, what is your sexual ethic? What do you believe that sex is, and how are you going to practice that? So we talk about that. Again, this consent piece is pretty abstract for kids, but also for seniors, and for senior high schoolers, it's a big deal. Like, even the social pressure of like, come on, you want to. Yeah. Or like, I was so surprised growing up and getting to college, and we're talking about sex, I'm just going to say it, like, hearing about the number of women that talked and had men complaining about blue balls blew my mind. Like, it's a woman's problem. Like,
but so...
Sorry.
It's interesting that you kind of like lead consent into just being abstract for junior highs. I, as an adult, I feel like consent can be pretty abstract.
Totally.
And I mean, as a woman, of course, I've gotten all sorts of shades of the whole not totally understanding no scenario. But I also feel as though women do it too, but they do it in a different way.
Yeah.
So instead of the whole, like, come on, like, you hear a lot of the, what are you, gay kind of response.
No, totally, yeah, for men too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, the end of that, we talk gender identity, which is a lot of pressure in junior high, right?
Mm-hmm.
You look like a girl or a fag or, how butch, we try and limit things, especially at a time when people are looking for their identity. We want to talk about how, like, there's a lot of different variation in gender and how to and gender expression. And really, the goal isn't to be political in any of this. It's to enable kids to have their own identity and not feel like there's this cloud of shame floating over them as they're developing. Because that's totally going to stunt their identity piece, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that in Christianity there is a lot of there's a lot of dialogue on what that can look like, right? And this is one area that I'm just like going to hold at an arm's distance because it's an ongoing conversation and we're still talking about how to talk about it.
Yeah.
But I think what I like about this is that it gives teenagers some permission to relax a little bit, and again, not aspirate and try and feel like they have to have this figured out, because it's a lifelong journey, right? Of identification in who you are. Like, be a positive influence. Okay, here's something was so impactful for me about this. It's our last week of sex and dating. We do a Q&A panel. We bring in people who waited till marriage, didn't wait till marriage. We always have a nurse or a doctor on the panel, and then some of our leaders. And so, that there's a panel and you can anonymously ask questions. So impactful as a high schooler. You get some, terrible sex act name questions, like, what's a rusty trombone? Is one that like comes out over the years. I know that, honestly, it's so intimidating even sitting on that as an adult, because you're like vulnerable and talking about this with kids that you see every week, and sometimes their parents are in the room, but it's really, I think it's been so impactful to do this, especially for the what's normal and what's anatomy. Is this a normal shape or a curve, or what is this on my body? And that you have trusted people that you can ask about those things that aren't your parents, but also that it's not going anywhere.
Yeah.
I think one of the interesting things is too talking. This is what I was going to come back to.
Yeah.
Right. That we talk about. And there's been some debate about the statistic, right? But 1 in 4 college girls are sexually assaulted, right? But what's interesting is there's no strong support system, like no good in to talking about the 1 in 7 men who've been assaulted or abused, and so this is also the moment to go like, men can be raped, and talk about the physiology of that that arousal isn't consent, right? That you can really help put this in perspectives, and it also gives teenagers an opportunity to go to what is actually a caring relationship, and did you wait till marriage? And again, having a broad spectrum of leaders to be able to say, I did, I didn't, this is how it affected things. You're not damaged goods,
Survivors of rape and sexual abuse, especially if they're religious, this idea that since they lost their virginity, they lost kind of an angelical part of them. And
it's not just, I think it's more extreme with sexual assault and rape, but it's not just that, right? Sometimes, again, if we're in a shame dialogue, right, that you're damaged goods, even if you're not a virgin, And again, that's not our emphasis, and I think that's just a total lie.
Mm-hmm.
You know, man, I hate. There's this this like youth image that, and maybe it's not a youth image, maybe it's a whole church image that was passed around for a while of like two pieces of construction paper, and it's glue and it's slapped together, you know, and your soul, right? The two became one flesh, and so you rip it apart and you're ripping your soul apart. And I don't think that's the case at all. I think that the mystery of marriage and oneness of marriage is again about relationship and a spiritual connection and wholeness, right? I think that's centered in God. And if there's anything that's a true narrative about the Bible and about Christianity, it's that God is in the process of meeting us where we're at. We're redeeming. And redeeming is just this way of saying, like, doing all the work, right, to meet us where you can find us. I mean, even think of like Jesus, this idea of God made flesh in the incarnation. Think about that from maybe a more theological or philosophical concept. There's a God who is perfect, who's all-powerful and omnipresent, but comes into time and space to be known. There's no benefit for him in that, right? It's solely for us. And even the angels in the Christmas narrative, like, they declare it, right? Peace and goodwill towards men. Like, not like goodwill towards God. Of course it benefits God. That's his plan. But his plan is to come close to us.
So how would you take that for someone who has survived?
Survived rape? I'd say this. You aren't damaged goods. You are loved and cherished, and that wasn't how your value was depicted in God's eyes anyways. Your value comes from the fact that you're his child. You belong and are to be connected with him, right? In joy and in wholeness. I think on the back of that, I'm so sorry. There is suffering in this world, and that's something that was inflicted upon you. And this idea that you're damaged goods in some way is just utter crap. It's not true. It's not even true biblically. And that there's whole realities of wellness, of healing, that marriage is all totally viable, right? That, like, spiritually, it's not like you're disconnected. Again, the goal is this wholeness of relationship, and that's all accessible to you, right? And so that's going to take time to do that. There's no guilt in that. There's no rushing into that. There's no one way or perfect image. It's all this spiritual pursuit of relationship and connectedness. And so, of course, do that with a partner that's going to meet you in that, but pursue wholeness and health. Pursue relationship and connection.
Beautiful answer. For those who fail to stick to this sex until marriage, do you think that ultimately God can forgive them?
Again, the only thing that severs forgiveness, the relationship with God, are the things that sever connection and relationship with God. Sin is something that is representative of that, but it's bigger than just like our actions, right? So it's an oxymoron at that point, right? Of course God forgives, and God comes first. Forgiveness is always there. Redemption is always available. That's God's character, is loving, compassion, kindness, goodness, right?
The second
Thank you
interview
so much,
is
Matt,
with
for
a
your
woman
time.
who
No
means a lot to me, the marvelous Melissa Giovale. She founded the Bell Garden Center in Flagstaff, Arizona, which is a center for Buddhists in the small mountain town community. Melissa is also my aunt. Hey. She is a wonderful, caring woman, and she officiated my marriage. That's a true story. She's been a great person for me to look up to my entire life. She's just awesome, and I love her. Her interview is a lot shorter than Matt's because it turns out sex can be a lot simpler in other beliefs. Let's go on in. What is your role within the Buddhist community?
Well, I founded Bell Garden Buddhist Center, and I think probably the easiest way to understand my role is looking at it from like a more administrative point of view, where I helped to build a center so that the teachings would be available, the Buddhist teachings would be available to people who are interested in learning about it. And so creating space and a meditation hall where we could have teachings and retreats and weekly group meditations and things like that. So I really gained a lot from studying Buddhism and wanted to do what I could to make those teachings accessible to others. And so that's really been my role in the Buddhist community in Flagstaff for the past, almost 20 years. I've been involved in one way or another, mostly in coordinating, coordinating events and bringing things together. And I've led some retreats and I've led a lot of group meditations. I don't really consider myself a teacher. I consider myself more a Buddhist practitioner. But most of my exposure has been to Tibetan Buddhism.
What would you say is the Tibetan Buddhist view on sex?
So I was thinking about how to, answer this question. And Buddhism is often called the middle way. And so I think one of the big differences between Buddhism and other religions is that Buddhism doesn't give you a lot of rules or commandments. Like there's certain guidelines and practices, but there's not a lot of you should do this and you shouldn't do that in terms of certain activities. I'm going to back up a little bit. To be Buddhist, like from the Buddhist point of view, you're really not Buddhist until you have taken refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. So the Buddha is, the historical Buddha, Buddha Shakyamuni. The Dharma are the Buddhist teachings, and then the Sangha, that's the community that upholds the Buddhist teachings and passes on the wisdom of the Buddha. And so in America, there's a lot of people who attend Buddhist retreats and group meditation sessions who are interested in Buddhism, but haven't taken that formal vow. And so it's interesting because, traditionally, like in Asia, if you haven't taken that formal vow, you're not Buddhist. I'm not sure how people think of it in the US. I think a lot of people think of themselves as Buddhist, but they haven't yet taken that vow. But one of the reasons why I'm talking about it is before you take the vow, you would receive teachings on what it means to take the vow and to uphold the vow. And one of the main tenets of taking this vow is, so you're going for refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And one of the commitments that you make is to not harm others. And so what does that mean? To not harm others. And in Buddhism, we have a lot of discussion around that. And there's a lot of kind of like gray areas. And I think one of the areas that comes up is around sex and sexuality. And so when you have made a commitment to somebody and you go back on that commitment, then you're harming them. And so the Buddhist view on sex is at least my understanding of it is, engage in a way that won't create harm. And if you can, have relationships that cultivate happiness for yourself and for others. And then, of course, there's the monastic tradition in Buddhism. And if a Buddhist practitioner decides to take monastic vows, then they are, for the time that they have those vows, they are not engaging in any sexual activity. And that's so that they can fully devote their energy and mind to their Buddhist practice.
I do like the aspect of not causing harm to another person, because that can be, in a sexual term, interpreted in many different ways. You've already brought up the concept of cheating. Like, if you've made a promise to someone and you break that promise, that is causing harm. And on top of it, that there is the concept of consent. To not listen to someone or to force something upon them they don't want is to cause harm. So all that makes sense. However, Western culture is very associated with the Judeo-Christian belief in which sex is something to be saved for marriage. Is that something that is talked about in Buddhism?
That is not a belief that I'm aware of in Buddhism. If you don't have to be married, you're not supposed to be married. Really, again, it's coming back to, is this relationship going to bring happiness? Will these two individuals enjoy having sex? Can they bring pleasure to each other? There's stories even of great female practitioners who were prostitutes. So I would say definitely that is not a view in Buddhism, that you have to wait to be married and wait to have this commitment of marriage in order to have sex. Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, because I know very little about religion, and Buddhism is included in that statement, but is a big part of Buddhist belief this idea to separate yourself from material things of this world and additional human errors that limit your mind?
Yeah, I think you could say that. It's fair to say that. There's many different types of Buddhism. There's different lineages, and those different lineages have a different focus. In Tibetan Buddhism, it's a little different. They really embrace the world, you could say. But one thing that you're always working on is, it's like the field of practice in Buddhism is your mind. And so what you're working on, that Buddhist non-attachment, is something that happens within your mental state. So we are, like, as a Buddhist practitioner, you are always watching your mind and asking yourself, what state of mind am I in? And if you identify some negative emotions, a lot of times that's then linked to some attachment that you have. Like, oh, I really want this. Or some aversion that you have. Oh, I don't want this. Like, you want to push something away. So that grasping at or pushing away, we work with a lot in Buddhism. And those attachments and aversions kind of create negative emotions. I didn't get what I want, therefore I'm angry. Or I got something that I really didn't want and I'm really sad about it. And so the mind training, there's a lot of mind training in Buddhism. And when you're watching your mind and you see that you're sad or you're angry, you can start to dissect that and see, like, okay, well, where's this coming from? And then there's different teachings and different kind of what they call antidotes that you can apply to, let's say, you're angry. because somebody did something that you felt was harmful. And so there's different teachings, such as the teachings on impermanence and compassion. And you can apply those teachings to help you kind of loosen your negative emotion, your negative response, and hopefully over time come to some kind of understanding about what had happened.
So, how does that connect to human sexuality? Because so much of it is based off of feelings, elements of being on this world, and grasping.
Right. It's a really good question. And if you were talking to a Buddhist scholar, it'd be very interesting to see what they have to say about it. Because traditionally, Buddhism, I mean, there were a lot of monastics. And there probably are some lineages that would say you really can't fully do the Buddhist practice if you're engaged in a sexual relationship, because there's too much. There's too much desire, there's too much grasping. And also, there can be a lot of aversion. Yeah. It's definitely something to think about. And then I guess on the other hand, this is why what I love about Buddhism is, that it is the middle way. And so I guess, as a practitioner, you kind of have to know what you want from your practice. Do you want to have that state of mind that is not grasping and averse all the time, and you're willing to give up an intimate relationship? Or do you want to work on, those elements of your practice within an intimate relationship? I mean, certainly being in an intimate relationship gives you a lot to work with, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, you're going to have more as a practitioner to apply the teachings to.
Something I find really interesting is the fact that the theory of being abstinent at the highest level of religious practice is something that reoccurs across many different faiths. In Catholicism, the leaders are famously abstinent since its inception, I think. What is interesting to me, at least within Christianity, there are tiered levels to human sexuality. So within Catholics, the leaders need to remain abstinent, but sex is okay for followers, but for procreation only. A lot of Protestant faiths, sex is okay, but within marriage only. Are there tiered beliefs on sex within the Buddhist faith?
Okay, so again, there's lots of different lineages. And so just like in Christianity, So in Tibetan Buddhism, there are tantric practices that involve sex. And so sex can then be used to enhance one's practice. And so those practices, they're secret, so I actually can't really talk too much about them.
Okay.
I can say very little about them, actually. And but you're cultivating. So, we talked about that not grasping. And so you're engaging in sex, which has a high level of desire and grasping, right? So you're engaged in sex. You say like you're grasping or you're wanting that orgasm, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in the tantras, you would be breaking your commitment if you orgasmed. So it's called a practice of unbearable bliss. And so you learn how to work with your mind and your body to ride that wave of bliss without grasping. for an orgasm.
Okay.
So yeah. And so Buddhism, like I said, there's not a lot of rules about, like, sex is inherently bad. You would never hear that in Buddhism. Everything can be cultivated in a way so that it can enhance a person's practice. And of course, I just want to emphasize that this would all be done within the context of, a relationship that's of two equals, two people who are, all that are engaged in consensual sex. And
During your time at Bill Garden, did the LGBTQ community come up at all?
a little bit, it would come up a little bit. And again, Buddhism is just very open. So there's a lot of practitioners who are part of that community who would come to the teachings and to the center because they feel welcomed and accepted, for being who they are. And the teachings themselves, it just comes back to, don't do something that's going to harm yourself or anyone else. And obviously, being part of that community doesn't bring harm. And so it's accepted.
Do you think that there is a difference between Western and Eastern Buddhism?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I think, in Asia, from what I can tell and what I've seen, it's really, these huge monasteries are very patriarchal. And in the West, even though most of the teachers are men, the communities, I would say they're 80% female.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of female Buddhist practitioners. And I think there's a number of female Buddhist teachers, more and more. And I think that it does make it different in the West to have more female teachers. And it's not as formal. In the West, it's not as formal as it is in Asia.
Mm-hmm. Well, this was pretty straightforward. We asked you what the Buddhist view on sex is, and you said as long as you're not causing harm to anyone else, you're good. Is that a fair summary?
I think it is. I think it is. As long as you're not harming and your intent is to bring happiness to others, that you can kind of sum it up that way. Certainly that's what my point of view is. I'm sure somebody from a different Buddhist lineage could have a very different point of view.
Oh, sure.
From what I've studied, that's my take on it.
I am curious. You were raised Mormon.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
How did you jump from being LDS to Buddhist?
I don't know. I never really could embrace the Mormon beliefs, even at a very young age. I remember being like 11 years old and telling my parents, like, I'm done. I'm just not going to go. I don't understand why they have all these rules about drinking coffee and, you can't have coffee, you can't have alcohol. There's just like too many rules. I don't get it. And then, of course, my dad drank coffee all the time. So that was just confusing to me as a child. And then how Buddhism kind of was first introduced to me is I went on a family trip. And we went to Thailand and Hong Kong. And we were on a bus, like getting a tour of Hong Kong, and some guy from Texas asked a question about Buddhism. And I think it was something like, well, what do Buddhists think about drinking? I think that's what it was. It was about alcohol. And the bus driver said, oh, we don't really have a lot of rules in Buddhism. And to me, I was like, what? you're a religion that doesn't have a bunch of do's and don'ts. What is this magic? And I was 16 at the time. And I remember coming home from that trip and telling my friends that, I was going to be Buddhist. And then sure enough, like 11 years later, that was when I actually took the Buddhist vow, the refuge vow. So basically for me, it just felt very liberating to have a religion that would let you make your own decisions and your own choices without a bunch of guilt and shame.
Was it hard to leave the LDS faith and be Buddhist?
Again, I don't think I ever really embraced the Mormon beliefs. So I didn't have to work too hard to get away from it. I think what's harder is just all the gender roles that we have as a culture, in American culture. And I'm still working on that. And yeah, definitely our religious beliefs play into that. But, all of these beliefs that I feel a lot of us, we haven't really examined it and looked at our roles and asked ourselves, why do I feel that way? Why do I dress this way? Why, as a woman, who's 47 years old, why am I trying to hold onto this standard of outward beauty,
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm female. Certainly men don't have to do that.
No.
Not at all. Looking at sex and inevitably that we're going to be looking at gender roles.
Oh yeah, it pops up a lot, and we're really trying to remain gender neutral, but it is really difficult when you're talking about sex because many things are written to a specific gender, and medical terms are frequently gendered. So the three of us are trying to be better. I think I am the worst offender in comparison to Colin and Marcella, but it is on the mind. So within Western Buddhism, can you see an evolution regarding better gender roles and how we address gender?
Yes, absolutely, especially with the Western teachers. I think that there's a lot of awareness. One of the groups that meets at Bill Garden, Flagstaff Insight Meditation Community, their main teacher, Brian Lesage, I've attended a few retreats with him, and I think him and a lot of his colleagues are talking a lot about gender roles and really looking into it and, asking the question, like, is this harmful to have this point of view?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that there's a lot of discovery happening, taking some of these Buddhist principles in mind training and applying it to where we are today, where there's a real blur of gender roles. And I think it's wonderful, personally. Like, my kids went to an art school in Flagstaff, and they have several friends who are trans. And to me, I just think, oh my goodness, how is this going to change gender equality? How is this going to change all these different ideas that we have around gender roles? I'm personally excited about it.
Thank you, Melissa, for speaking with us. This has been very helpful.
It's been my pleasure to talk with you, Megs.
Yeah, and if this ends up being the only episode you ever listen to because you are my aunt, that'll be okay.
Colin, Marcella, and I aren't going to comment because unless it is intended to harm others, spiritual belief cannot be right or wrong. I do not believe there is a single part of Matt or Melissa that is ill-intended. Before we end this episode, we would like to shout out Katya Vetrov, who gave us our very first podcast review. Thank you so much. We love you. We love your review. Thank you. This shout out has been a long time coming. You gave it to us, this review, on March 11th. I'm really sorry it took us so long, but we got here. Also, you gave us this review before Colin stated he would write a poem of your choice, but we still want to offer this to you. Please shoot us an email at remedialsexed@gmail.com, and he will pass on his lovely words to you about anything you want. The state of the world, puppies, Netflix's Sabrina, great butt stuff, literally anything you want. Follow us on the social medias, leave us a review, and find a way today to tell someone you love them. Okay, thanks. Bye!
You will agree that the concepts will contribute to the rearing of a mature person.
An absence of
Oh, yeah, you don't have to be thinking about sex.